Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Development Control and Regulatory Board. This day, 12th of September 2019. I'd like to remind everyone present that this meeting will be broadcast live via the County Council website and will also be available for viewing on the County Council website after the meeting. Please, when you're using your microphones, to obviously turn them on when you're speaking and turn them off when you're not speaking or when you've finished speaking. Thank you. Membership of the committee today. Mr. Corcoran is substituting for Mr. Gamble, and Mrs. Richards is being substituted by Mr. Parton. And Mrs. Page is replacing David Jennings. On that, it is with great sadness that I report the death of David Jennings, the sitting member and current Vice Chairman of the County Council. David died on the 30th of August, aged 72. He has been a member of the County Council since 1997 and represented Cosby and Countersthorpe electoral division. David was a long-standing member of the Development Control and Regulatory Board and served as chairman between 2003 and 2011. I ask members of the council to join me in standing in silence as a tribute to the memory of David Jennings, a colleague and our friend. Thank you. We'll move on to the agenda. Item 1, minutes of the meeting held on the 11th of July 2019. If we're all happy with those, would someone move that we receive them? Seconder anywhere?
Second, Chair.
Yeah. All in favour? Thank you. Looks to be all unanimous. Question time. We haven't any questions. Item 3 is questions asked by members under Standing Orders 7.3 and 7.5. There are none of those been put forward. Item 4 is to advise of any other items the Chairman has decided to take as urgent elsewhere on the agenda. We haven't any of those. Declarations of interest. I'll just read the usual thing out. It is noted that all members who are members of a parish, town, district or liaison committee will have personal interests in those applications which relate to areas by those authorities. Are there any further declarations? That looks to be no, Ewan. Thank you. Item 7 then, that's moving on to the agenda items. We've been requested or asked by
Petitions,
sorry?
no petitions.
Oh,
Petitions.
oh, sorry, I've missed number 6 out. Petitions. We haven't received Any petitions? Item number 7 is going back on the agenda again then. Mr Galton, who wishes to speak on item number 10, has asked if we can bring this forward to deal with this, because he's got other business to attend to. So if everyone's in agreement, we'll move to item number 10 first. Okay. Right, we'll move on to item number 10 then. Which is an application for a new 2-storey classroom block providing 6 classrooms and toilets. I'll ask Nick to, if he'd present this item then, please.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, everybody. Item 10 is an application for a 2-storey classroom block to be constructed within the grounds of Fernvale Primary School in Harborough District. The school will provide 6 additional classrooms and proposes a 134 square metre extension to the hard play area. The proposal also includes an alteration to the car park to provide additional parking spaces. So this is the proposed site layout. So the proposed 6 classroom block is going to be located to the northwest of the site. It's been located adjacent to an existing hard surfaced area, and it's proposed to replace the area lost as part of this proposal by creating a new extended hard play area just to the east. As I mentioned a moment ago, there will be an extension to the existing car park area. So the access arrangements are currently shown on the plan, and there will be additional car parking bays created. In a moment I'll show you the revised car parking layout plan. So this is an aerial photograph, again just showing the existing configuration of the site. We have a polytunnel there which will be relocated. The proposed 6 classroom block will be located there to the northwest, and you'll see that there are residential properties to the western side of this, and the intention of the design of the building is that it will be staggered away from those residential properties, and in a moment I'll show you the elevations and layout plan and how they've sought to minimise any overlooking by keeping the windows away from that elevation and obscure glazing those that are proposed. So these are the elevations. So the eastern elevation looks into the tarmacked play area, and you'll see lots of windows to the classrooms are located on that side. The image to the bottom is the west elevation, and that's the elevation facing the residential properties. Very minimal windows proposed on that elevation, and the ones that are proposed will be serving toilets and will be obscure glazed. This is the north and south elevation. You'll see that the materials for these are buff brick at ground floor with rendered, white rendered finish at the upper floor. So in terms of the internal configuration, as I mentioned a moment ago, the western elevation is the sensitive one in relation to residential properties, and there are no windows proposed to the classrooms on that side. There are toilets at both ground and first floor, and that's where the high-level windows are proposed that will be obscure glazed. All the windows to the classrooms are located on the eastern elevations. Just a few photographs. So this is a photo taken from within the hard surface play area looking towards the polytunnel that I mentioned a few moments ago, and the new classroom block will be located in this area. The residential properties are visible in the distance behind some existing planting. And an image looking to the south towards where there is an existing small bungalow in the distance, which I'll talk about in a few moments, that's actually used for storage purposes, but again this is where the new building will be located. So in terms of car parking, always a sensitive issue when we deal with applications to extend schools. The existing car park has 15 parking spaces, and you'll see on this image the the bungalow that I referred to a few moments ago that's used for storage now. The main school building is here, and just to the north is where the new 6 classroom block would be located. This image shows the proposed parking area, so you can see a substantial increase in the number of parking bays, increasing to 28 spaces, and they've achieved this by creating a hard surfaced area to the front of the bungalow and creating additional spaces, and there will be a link through down the side of the bungalow to provide access through for servicing purposes for the new teaching block. You'll also see on here that there's additional parking bays being created which are not independently accessible, so that will be managed internally by the school, so they'll be used by staff, and they would manage those spaces to allow at the end and the start of each day for those to be used and minimise the impact on on-street car parking. This is the photograph to the front of the bungalow, so this is where the additional hard surfaced area will be created. Yeah, and that's the last of the photographs. So you'll see from the report we're recommending approval. One of the issues, as I mentioned, is the ability to integrate an extension to a school of this scale without causing congestion and problems on the highway network and on surrounding residential streets. Pupil numbers will increase from 270 to 420. The comments from our highways colleagues are that we require an updated travel plan to minimise additional journeys by private car, and you're seeing that the additional car parking bays will also help in terms of preventing certainly people driving by car from parking on the streets in the surrounding area. There are parking restrictions on those roads, particularly immediately in front of the school, which would also help. In terms of design, we're happy with the design that's being proposed. We believe it's in keeping and it's not harmful to visual amenity. It is away at the back of the site, so it's not immediately visible from the street. We've got conditions to control construction working times and to agree a construction management plan. We have a condition dealing with tree planting and also for protection of existing trees, and also, as I say, to provide an updated school travel plan. So recommendation to approve. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Nick. As I said, Mr. Galton has asked to come and speak. Mr. Galton, would you like to just sit over there, please? And if when you finish speaking, if you just remain in case any councillor wants to ask you a question.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Obviously, I do recognise that when you have large-scale housing development, as is taking place in the area, you do need to create additional school places. So I fully accept that that's got to be done, and there's been substantial Section 106 agreements in place too. So it's been known that this is coming, but it's really about trying to make the best out of a bad situation, because as members have seen, it is bang smack in the middle of a 1960s and 1980s residential area, and there are two major concerns. The first is car parking by people bringing children to school, parents bringing children to school, and the impact that has on local residents living in the area. I'm sure every member has a school in an urban or semi-urban area has this same problem, but the problem is that as housing development is taking place, it's happening on the edge of the village, and so what people are coming by car more because the distances are increasing as the housing developments spread further into the countryside. They have done a number of measures, put in some parking restrictions, but I have to say, on the whole, there is still a significant problem, and you've heard that the numbers of children will increase significantly as a result of the 6 new classrooms. So that's the first issue. I'm not honestly sure what can be done about that. If someone had cracked that, they'd be a very rich person now. The issue I think that something can be done about is the on-site parking for staff, and I have been in regular touch with the case officer, and the 13 spaces does represent an improvement on what was originally proposed. The plan was amended during the course, but there is still concern by local residents about not just staff but visitors to the school during the day, contractors and all the other types of people that visit a school about where they're going to park, and inevitably lead to more on-street parking, even if it's only the short term. And 6 classrooms and the support staff, not just the teachers, there is a significant concern about parking. So I don't know whether anything more can be done. I do have some concerns about this double parking and whether that's realistic. It will take significant management by the school for that to work properly and for people to use that. And then the final point, mention was made of construction times, but I really do foresee problems as to where contractors' vehicles are going to park on site. So the white vans, the subcontractors, where are they going to park? I don't know if it's possible to condition it to ask for the additional parking to be in place before development proper commences on the building, because at least they could then use that, because obviously the new staff won't be coming in until the building's completed. So I would ask the committee to consider whether that additional parking could be put in place, even if it was only in a base core standard for these contractors that are going to be on site. And I'd just ask the question whether it's known whether this construction is going to take place while the school is open and children are there and all the attendant parking problems I've already described, or whether, as is often the case, these developments take place when the school's closed, because the best time for this to happen, given that it is going to happen, would actually be the school holidays. But I don't know whether that's a matter we can have any control over. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you for letting me make my concerns and those of the local residents known.
Thank you, Mr. Galton. Are there any questions to Mr. Galton on what he's said? Dan?
I think, and I'm asking you this really, Simon, whether there's a situation would exist that you could create a one-way system, but a permanent one-way system that sort of then alleviates the element slightly, where traffic would only be going in one direction. And the other is whether the pavements, because some developments and some of the older ones, the pavements were quite more generous than what we have nowadays, whether there was chance that they could be taken back a bit either side. If that was the case, and if that's no twice, well then you've got problems, and it's just like every other school, unfortunately. But I do take up your point, which I would support, that some basing is done, Mr. Chairman, as early as possible to allow contractors to be able to park in there a bit more sensible. We're not talking of finish, but we've got to think of the people who live there. If there's some way you can get contractors more onto the site, I think that'd be excellent. Thank you.
Jim, just in response, I think it would be very difficult to create a one-way situation in a housing estate probably totaling 400 dwellings and increasing. I think it would be extremely difficult to do that, and then there'd only be one way technically in. Taking some of the footway to create that's an interesting idea, Chairman. I suspect that could be done, but I suspect it would probably be unreasonable to ask the school to pay for that as part of this project. And there is an existing community problem there, and of course our highways department isn't flush with cash either. So I'm sure it could be done, but I don't know who'd pay for it.
Mrs. Wright?
Quick question. Has the school come up with any sort of ideas or anything how to deal with it, with a travel plan or anything like that?
Through the school has been very proactive with their travel plan and involving the community and the parish council. The parish council pays for additional civil enforcement patrols out of its own budget outside this school and the other school in the local community. And indeed, they have created a second pedestrian access to try and take off from the new housing and share that. The problem is, parent behaviour is that they need to get to work. They want to drop their children off as quickly as possible. Right outside of the school gate is the nearest location. The other pedestrian access is some distance away. So I think that they will continue to do what they can through the travel plan, but I don't underestimate the difficulties.
Okay. I'm just a bit concerned, Rosita, that we're going to drift in. Carry on then.
Thank you. I like the idea of the construction management and parking, because having been there will be things like street cleaners and all sorts of construction traffic. But my question to Simon is, I don't know the area, and I noticed some residential properties very close to. Do you feel that there will be a negative impact on them, and that the landscaping and the proposals here to protect those dwellings is adequate?
That's a difficult one, Chair, because I've not viewed it, from the gardens of those properties, so I'm not really in a position to comment. I believe there were some representations on that. The scheme was modified, there were changes made, and if you've heard from the officers there, the windows are now either obscure or absolutely minimised in that side. So I think that they've gone as far as they can. In terms of the residents in front of the school, yes, they are, their lives are daily affected by the parking issue. Sorry, I have to come back to that, because I get regular phone calls and asked to go and stand with them. Some of it is a management problem, but some of it I believe that the sorts of issues we spoke about, construction, could be dealt with and addressed.
Chairman, could we have an update from the officers in relation to the properties, to the school, and the protection of around?
Yeah, I think you will. If you want to re-ask that in debate, because I mean it was just for clarification question to Simon. That's it, Simon. I think you're free to go. Okay. Nick, have you got any further comments at this time?
Yes, thank you, Chair. A few points raised there that I'd like to pick up on, if that's okay. First of all, in relation to when the works will be carried out, I don't have an answer to that one, but I think, as was suggested, these works tend to take place during the school holidays, where it doesn't have the conflict in terms of construction vehicles with the pupils coming and going from the school. And I would expect that to be the case for a structure of this size and a school that's obviously congested. The car parking area. You've seen there's a condition on there recommending a construction traffic management plan, and I see no reason why that area to the left-hand side of the access, where which is to the front of the bungalow, couldn't be formed and be used for construction traffic. There's also the area to the side, and they would need to segregate off the construction works, the contractors carrying out those works, from the pupils if there is any overlap. And I would envisage that will be where the vehicles will be parked, and certainly you wouldn't expect them to be parked all over the residential streets outside. But I will raise that with our colleagues in education, as that's been mentioned by members today. In terms of the impact on residents, there's a landscaping condition proposed. Now, there's already landscaping adjacent to where the 6 classroom block is located and the residential properties. Additional planting will be required as part of that condition, and I would envisage that would strengthen the boundary. But as I've mentioned already, that there isn't any overlooking. The staggering and design of the building is such that any overbearing and impact from loss of light will be very much reduced. And I'd agree with Mr. Galton that the position and design is probably as good as we could get in that location. I think that's covered most of the points, but happy to answer any other questions. Thank you.
You can. Do we have a second? Mr. Bentley? Does anyone else want to speak? Mr. Crooks?
Thank you, Chairman. Outside most schools, there's now yellow zigzag lines. Some are adopted, some aren't adopted. I've got one in my area where they've just expanded the school by 100 places, and I note that this one is for 150 places. And I was called out there last week, and it was absolute chaos outside. People couldn't get out the drives or anything. They're double parking on the pavement and on the road. It's got yellow zigzag lines. I asked for the camera van to come out, and apparently some of the lines are adopted and some aren't. And one, I'd like clarification on that, and two, I think it should be a condition that if schools are having big extensions like this with already existing parking problems, then those yellow lines should be adopted. Apparently, it's part of the problem with my area is that the school hasn't produced a travel plan, and that's one of the reasons why it's not adopted. And I've checked with the head, and he says it's on his things to do list, but that's not helping residents. You know, I had the gentleman that called me out had had a medical appointment with his doctor at 9 o'clock, and he couldn't get out of his drive because they'd blocked him. Time he'd gone across to the school, and he is elderly, doesn't walk very quick. He'd missed his appointment, and he's had to go get another one. So, you know, we should be enforcing these yellow lines and making sure that before they have these extensions, that this travel plan is in place so that we can send the camera van out to nick people who are parking in the wrong place. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Chair. As has been said, we all have schools in our areas where there's particular issues around parking and traffic. It would be nice, on page 122, it mentions the County Council's design guide. It would be nice if I could be sent the particular portion that relates to schools and parking within those schools. Because I don't know what schools, you know, we get each application says so many spaces and so many staff. It would be nice to see what sort of design guide you and the applicants are working to, so I can get a better understanding of it. Because at the moment I'm a little unclear. You see schools which provide plenty. I mean, they're going to have to manage this one particularly carefully as they're blocking in. So clearly staff are going to have to be cooperating and understanding who finishes and who starts when. I understand on this one that there's not enough space at the moment for staff, and they're parking in the side streets, which is concerning because then the space is provided, although they've increased, probably still won't be sufficient for the people that are at the school. And that is a concern. When I was a chair of governors, school travel plans, because the vast majority of schools at that time were under local authority control, and school travel plans were reasonably effective and people were working towards them. But since it's sort of academisation's come in, I think there's so many other priorities for schools. School travel plans, as has been mentioned, get put on the back burner and are not being addressed in an effective way to deal with this. I mean, potentially it's another 60% traffic for this school with another 150 pupils. If it's difficult now, it's going to be more difficult, as it is with all schools across the county. I just think there has to be a better way somewhere. I know we have the keep clear zigzags outside of schools, and I know in my particular area of East Wigston we've introduced more yellow lines in the surrounding junctions and streets. It never gets rid of the problem, it moves it back. And you see crowds of parents sitting in cars, engines running, waiting for the 3 o'clock. School travel plans, nice idea, but they ain't working.
Thank you, Michael. Sean?
Yeah, I'm afraid it's car parking again. Page 123, paragraph 12. It's a bit glib there when it says these spaces will be managed by the schools. They're the ones that are doubled up. I just wonder how much opportunity the school, and particularly the staff involved, who had to comment on this, and whether there is actually some agreement there that they can manage this, or whether we're just assuming that.
Thank you. Officers, you wanted to speak on?
Yeah, the internal layout of the school would be the school's responsibility. It's not up to the local highway authority to manage that aspect. They put forward 13 additional spaces. I understand that there was 9 new staff members being as part of the proposal. So they have also addressed an existing problem that is going on at the moment. So if the committee would like to reduce that to 9 spaces, then that would be 1 for each member of staff, and that's what we assess it on the current application at the time. We can't look at existing situations as part of these planning applications, unfortunately. So,
Sure, that answers my question. I just want to know if the school have had an opportunity to say we're okay with this, or whether anybody's, my initial reaction to that would be, you're joking, you're going to block all these cars in. What about an emergency? Do the staff have some opinion on this? I would wonder.
Chair, just to comment on that. Yes, the school would have been part of the drawing up of these plans. It's a school that they manage, and they would need to make sure it operates effectively. Now, whether they're completely content in terms of how that would work is a different matter. I've known a number of schools where this has happened before, and some work well and some don't. It's down to the individual management. It's down to the individuals themselves in terms of their working patterns and what times they leave, and the relationships also amongst the teachers, and those sorts of issues. But it's certainly better to operate in this way than just to have independent spaces and then have fewer spaces, and that just means more cars are parked on the street. And I think that's the intention, just to allow the opportunity for more off-street car parking. The only other comment was about the zigzag lines and the enforcement of those. I don't know whether David wants to comment on that, because I think there's more information from when we spoke a little bit earlier.
yeah, Councillor Crooks raises the point about the advisory school keep clear lines. Apparently they are mandatory now outside this school. So that was implemented in June 2019. So if a school would like to approach the Highway Authority, we will look at that. But like you said, it's up to the headmaster of that school to approach the Highway Authority, and then the camera van can go out and look to enforce as well.
Mr. Crooks.
Come back on. But the problem is that if it's an academy and the head doesn't want to get involved with that, we've got nowhere to go. You know, it should be part of the conditions that we're. Well, I don't know where it's. I'm on about Nailston, not this one in my area. So, you know, it should, like I say, it should be a condition of the extension, which it wasn't, I don't believe, at the school I'm talking about in my area. But we should be looking to that, because parents are getting more and more issues because the schools are getting bigger. And, you know, we welcome that, because we've got to have schools and we've got to have somewhere for kids to go. But we've also got to respect the people in the area. But I mean, can that be looked at for the future applications?
The difficulty is that the way the system is administered, the school needs to approach the county council in order to request that the safety car is utilised for that particular school. And the planning system can't stray into those policy areas. That's a separate matter for the county council. It's a valid point, and I think that's something that probably needs to be taken up with colleagues who manage that section, so probably Environment and Transport Director.
Michael.
Very quickly, Chair. We normally see somewhere, and I may have missed it, how many staff there are at the moment and how many parking spaces there are at present.
Check existing staff numbers in the moment, but it's 9 additional staff. There's currently 15 parking bays, and there would be 28. So it's 13 additional to cater for the 9 additional staff. I'd have to double check the report to see how many existing staff we have at the moment.
Thank you. It's been moved and seconded. If there are no further questions or comments, we'll move to the vote. All in favour of the recommendation? Anyone against? No. Thank you. Move backwards then to agenda item number 7, which is the footpath at Ratcliffe Cooley. Mr. Cross, you're dealing with that, please.
Good afternoon, Chairman. Good afternoon, members. So turning to agenda item 7, this is a report in connection with an addition to the Council's definitive map. I'm going to ask my colleague Nisha Varia, who's the Council's lead highway solicitor, to present the report, and she'll be assisted by colleagues from Environment and Transport, Ed McWilliam and Stephen Tipping. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Anthony. Good afternoon, Chairman. Okay. This report starts at page 7, and I'll go through the law that applies to the report, and then my colleagues Ed and Stephen will go through the factual circumstances of the application. I will start at page 8 with a section entitled Background. This report relates to an application from Witherley Parish Council for the addition of public footpath in the village of Ratcliffe Cooley to the definitive map and statement, for which the County Council is surveying authority and so has a duty to keep under continuous review and to make definitive map modification orders to ensure that that happens. The claimed footpath is shown as A to B on the plan on the board there. Whilst the application to the County Council wasn't made until July 2017, a key fact to note is that at paragraph 7, which states that the claimed route was blocked in the 1970s and therefore the date when the status of the route was first brought into question is difficult to establish exactly due to the lapse of time. But based on the evidence reviewed by my colleagues, the date used for the route was being first brought into question is 1970. Accordingly, the 20-year period within which we are looking at evidence of usage is between 1950 and 1970. The lapse of time between 1970 and the date of the application of 2017 does not have any implications to the matters to be considered today. Once a path has come into existence, it remains forever, whether it is used or not, unless, of course, it is stopped by a legal process. The law with regard to this type of application is set out from paragraph 11 on page 9 onwards. Firstly, at paragraph 12, we give you section 53(2) of the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981, which deals with the County Council's responsibilities to maintain and keep updated the definitive map and statement. Paragraph 13 includes the types of circumstances that enables the County Council to review the definitive map. In this case, it's section 53, subsection 3C1, which is that a right-of-way which is not shown on the map and statement subsists or is reasonably alleged to subsist over land in the area to which the map relates, being a right-of-way to which this part applies. Before confirming the order, the authority or Secretary of State must be satisfied that the right-of-way has been shown to exist. There are 2 tests, so the issue before members is to decide if the application satisfies one of those. These tests are usually referred to as Test A, that is a right-of-way does subsist, or Test B, that a right-of-way is reasonably alleged to subsist over land. Our advice is that we should always look at Test B, the lower standard of proof. When we're looking at adding paths using presumed dedication, which we are here, the legal principles are contained within section 31 of the Highways Act, which starts at paragraph 17, page 10 of the report. To establish that a way has become a right-of-way, it is necessary to show that there has been uninterrupted use as of right by the public over a period of 20 years. This period is counted back from when the public's right was first brought into question, however long ago that date was. In this case, the date has been determined to be 1970, so we must look at the evidence of use or of interruptions of use between 1950 and 1970. Starting at paragraph 19, the report illustrates the type of actions a landowner can show that there was no intention to dedicate the land as a right-of-way. Members are asked to note that this area of land is actually unregistered with the land registry, and we're not aware of any landowner being involved. Part C of the report then goes through the evidence considered by the Rights of Way officers in Ed's team to assess whether to take this matter to the board and beyond. Ed and Stephen will take you through the evidence in detail, but in brief, we've looked at the definitive map, historical maps, Ordnance Survey maps, Enclosure Act, aerial photographs. Most importantly, however, is the user evidence submitted with the application and detailed starting at paragraph 34 on page 14. The user evidence is then subdivided, as you'll see, with the route walked, the type of use and status, purposes of using the path, if their use was ever brought into question, anything they can tell us about the use within this 20-year period, the frequency of their use, if they witnessed any other people using the path, if they were tenants or employees, because that type of use would then be unlikely. That type of use would be by permission, so unlikely to be as of right, which is what's required here for presumed dedication. Interruptions to their use, any actions to deter the use, whether it be verbal, prevent the use with structures or placing signs. The report then goes on to detail the summary of the user evidence and the characteristics of the path. This is then followed by the evidence of rebuttal and the officer's comments on the objections, starting at paragraph 57 on page 17. A site survey of the claimed path was also carried out by officers of the council in November 2018, which is detailed at paragraph 78 onwards. This process does take time, but effort is made to ensure compliance with the statutory process and that each element of the process to ensure that the criteria is met. One of which are the consultations detailed at paragraph 83, which were undertaken with interested parties, user groups and utilities. Apart from the ones that you'll be taking through in a minute, there were no further objections received. The report then takes you through the conclusion starting at paragraph 84 and summarises for you the relevant issues and comes to a conclusion with a recommendation that the claimed path should be added to the definitive map. My final point before I hand over to Ed is that should it be decided today to make the order, then the order would be made, but then that would invoke the statutory objection period. And there would be further opportunity for members of the public to make objections, in which case it would need to be submitted to the Secretary of State for determination. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, just to go through the actual nitty-gritty of the application itself. You'll notice in the map on the screen at the moment, and that's the order plan that's also included for you. We're in Ratcliffe Cooley, and Sketchley Lane there that's heading up towards the path itself. That's actually recorded as a public carriageway. There are public highway rights recorded on it. Have been since such routes have passed over to us in 1929. The section north of that point, between points A and B, the path being claimed, was not recorded as a public highway. Secondly, we have the recording of the definitive map and the associated footpaths, bridleways and byways with it, back in the time of the early 1950s and following on from a survey from the respective parish councils. At that time, the footpaths that you see shown on there were included as public highways, but again, the route between A and B was not actually recorded. As niche has been set out, I mean, we'll come back to the very quickly the historical evidence as well on the side. The main reason for the application in terms of it showing actual route has been created is the claim by the witnesses that they've used the path between points A and B for a period exceeding 20 years as of right, i.e. they haven't been claimed, they've walked down Sketchley Lane, walked along A to B and presumably come out on the footpath there. What is unusual, and Nisha's quite correct in saying should a highway come into being, Once a highway, always a highway, so to speak, but of course there are other legal mechanisms to end the life of a highway. But in this instance, members are being asked to go back in time a considerable period of time, back to the early 70s. I do remember the early 70s, but probably not that well, and indeed which paths I was using. So I would just have members bear in mind in terms of the length of time that we're actually looking back at the evidence available. In terms of that evidence, there we go. These are the extent of the evidence forms that have been put into us. Now, they are, in terms of, I would say there's more detail there in terms of, particularly on page 15 of user evidence. They are pretty good, actually, in terms of the evidence put towards us. And in terms of numbers, whilst it may not seem very many, that has been perfectly acceptable to the inspectorate in the past. But again, we are looking at a long time back, and you'll see one of the claims there, I think it's anonymous there, actually goes back to, I can't quite see from here, is it the early 1930s? And then finishes at the end of the war period, etc., etc. So we are going back quite a length of time in terms of those witness statements. Now, I think it'd be useful to you if my colleague now talked you through the route and described it within the context of Sketchley Lane as well.
Yeah, thank you. So the first photograph here would be looking towards point A on the proposed order plan. So we're standing on Sketchley Lane, looking north, and the start of the claimed path will be just beyond the car parked in the distance there. And if we go on to the next photo, we're now standing looking into the claimed path. We can see a garage on the left, and the footpath squeezes between the garage and the hedge, and past the telegraph pole you can see in front of you. We're now in the path which bends round slightly to the right. As you can see, this is all very overgrown, as you might expect after sort of 50 odd years of not being used, but it is a discernible route between two hedges. We've come forward a little bit. You can see a hedge on the right. The building on the right in the sort of top right-hand corner is the village post office, and then you're looking forward towards the garden space of the village post office. So if we come forward again, yeah, so on the right you can see the garden to the village post office. The hedge that may or may not have been there on the right is obviously not there anymore, but the boundary is marked out with some plastic electric fence posts, and in the distance is a pallet which marks, yeah, this is a view from the north side of the pallet. So obviously there was apparently a gap in the hedge which has been blocked up with a wooden pallet to make it stock proof, and you are now standing on the footpath in the field, which I think is T34, looking back into the start of the claimed path. And that's the extent of the photo survey. So on this plan, which is from the 1880s, this is an ordnance survey, one of their first edition 2,500 maps. You can see the row of cottages there on the right, which include current post office, and the claimed path appears to be more or less an extension of Sketchley Lane and continuous with it. And that is also the case obviously on the land registry plans, which show, if we go forward to that, there you can see what's registered in pink and what's not registered in white, and the whole of Sketchley Lane, including the claimed path, as you can see kinking round and then coming up to the end, all unregistered with no known landowner. And that's the extent of the survey. Thank you.
Yeah, I think what surprised us was that there was a fair bit of historical evidence relating to the route which hadn't really been looked into before that. As you see, Sketchley Lane, it's an extent at the end of the 19th century. The footpaths are on the definitive map. They do show that on the definitive map as well, sort of kink in to meet the end of the lane at that point. And also Ratcliffe Cooley Enclosure Act of 1766. Unfortunately, the map has gone for the Enclosure Award, but the route itself, and heading off to the west on the dotted line you see there, towards the Myth House, Pinwell Grange and Polesworth, it's described as at that stage, it is very well actually described. So it does look as though at that stage it certainly was a through route. And I suspect that it's simply fallen out of use for a variety of reasons, as discussed in that context as well. Now, Nisha also referred to some other points in terms of evidence of rebuttal, if I may go through those, from Miss Horton. And she had several points. Firstly, her family have been resident in Ratcliffe Cooley for 100 years. Her aunt still lives on Sketchley Lane itself, so very knowledgeable about the area. And that property actually has rights to access a water pump further down Sketchley Lane, and she believes that the claim path exists solely to provide access to the pump. When we look through the evidence forms in relation to that, clearly the evidence did indicate the people that were using it going down Sketchley Lane to link to the footpath to the north, as was the case with the Enclosure Award as well. Then she did say there was no documentary evidence to support the existence of the path. I have to say, to be fair, I think at that stage she wasn't, when she made that particular point, we hadn't actually unearthed the range of information we have at this point, and Stephen's nodding to me there.
Yeah, I think, well, we were still in the process of uncovering evidence at that point, so she wouldn't have seen all of the map evidence and everything we later gathered.
Then there was the point that Miss Hoyton and Miss Boyd, who are at number 16, that's the post office, they have been telling prospective path users that it's not a public right-of-way in recent years. Now, obviously, the evidence we're looking at is relating to deemed dedication that's occurred a long time ago, and also with some support from the historic information we've got as well. There's nothing as regards use of it in the recent past. And then finally, it's that there's a fact that there's no need for the path, as footpath T34, and that's the path over to the right near some farm buildings, could be used as an alternative. Now, unfortunately, in terms of that, what we're looking at is a claim that's come into us about a public right-of-way, a highway that's come into being or claimed to come into being, and that other consideration is not a matter for ourselves at this time. And then finally, she had concerns about local grass snakes, and certainly picked up on that, and you've seen the vegetation on this. Now, I stress should, members decide to proceed with the order, we will then, as Nisha's alluded to, then have to go through the main process, which is opening out to the public and inviting any reports from other people as regards it. But clearly we wouldn't carry out any works that would directly affect wildlife in an inappropriate way. We'd make sure we took account of that should we ever get to that stage. I think that's about it that I was actually going to mention. The only other thing is probably a reiteration of the actual recommendation.
Thank you. Is there any comments from Mr. Olds?
No comments.
Sean?
Yes, I want to thank Nisha, Ed and Stephen for what I think is a tidy piece of work, and I'm more than happy to support the recommendations. Thank you.
Mr. Crooks?
Thank you, Chairman. I know this area quite well. It's not in my area, it's in Councillor Olds, and I've seen him 2 or 3 times at various meetings this week, and he didn't mention any problems with this, and I presume he would have done, knowing that I'm on this committee. I think this was kicked off by, there's a footpath that was regularly used slightly further up the road, and a couple of years ago right on the edge of the footpath is an old brick barn, and it was all tumbling to pieces, and they closed it off for health and safety. And I think the parish council looked at other options, and it's took them a while to get themselves into gear and get this going. It's a small village, and we're talking of 49, 50 years ago that this was closed off. I suspect the previous occupier of the post office, which I think was the father of the lady that's objecting, took the law into his own hands and decided he preferred a cul-de-sac and just pulled his edge out and let it fall across a path, and nobody complained, and he got away with it for a while. But being as the land isn't owned by anybody, it shouldn't have been blocked off in the first place. So I'm told also by some of the residents that I've spoken to over the years that this used to be a route through to the kids to play in the River Sence, which is it's a big brook really. It's only a river in the winter when we have a lot of storms. And I know from my experience as a lad with no swimming pool, that was the first thing we did, was head for the nearest brook or river. And it's only a field away from the end of the T34, which is the footpath that this supposedly joins. And I'm also told that years before the school was built at Norton, they used to have to go across this way to Sheepy, to the school. So, there is evidence dating back to the late 1700s that there was a footpath there. And I'm happy with it. I'd like to support, members in supporting this to be opened again. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Michael, did you?
Just briefly, Chair. You know how cynical I can be. I think Mr. Crooks has explained why it's come forward, because that was going to be one of my questions. Why now? Why, when it was allegedly blocked off in the early 70s, wasn't there a stink then? Why didn't somebody say, look, they've found regular users from 50 years ago, whose memories, with the greatest respect, may not be as sharp as a young person. I'd have trouble remembering 50 years ago what paths I may have used around the countryside. And in Wigston, which is where I've lived all my life. I do believe there was some sort of path there, so I'm not arguing that. I'm just wondering why in the early 70s, because you look at the user bar chart that we saw, and half a dozen of them all finish on the same date, which seems quite convenient. Whether they've been talking to each other or they've agreed an approach with the parish council, I don't know. But I'm not going to object to it, but I do wonder if it was as well used as it was. Why? Was there a parish council then? I've no idea. Or whoever was in charge then, why didn't somebody say, look, the postmaster's chopped his edge down. Why hasn't something been done about it?
Thank you. Yeah, I can comment on those if the Chair would like.
Just let Bill finish.
Thanks, Chairman. It's just a small point. I'm going to page 20 now, paragraph 83, and it's on the consultations. I'm just picking up there why Harbury District Council would have been consulted, being about 30 miles away. I don't know whether it's supposed to be Inkley Borough Council, I would imagine. Yeah.
Oh, did you want to carry on then now Bill's spoken? I've just got Mrs. Page after that.
Thank you.
Can we have one meeting?
Yes,
please?
there's a few points raised. Yes, obviously that is a typo. It is Hinckley and Bosworth Borough Council. Going back to the question about why it wasn't raised in the 1970s, it has been suggested to me that obviously the local postmaster was the person implicated in blocking the path off, and it's quite important for a lot of people that they had access to the post office. And I know this is hearsay, but it is suggested that they were reluctant to upset the late postmaster. And so there was some grumbling, but on account of there being an alternative route, that nobody was inclined to make too much of it at the time. And I think there was obviously the blockage of the alternative route due to the unsafe farm building, which has now been demolished and made safe, I think sort of brought it back into people's minds, and then perhaps there was a feeling that it was now or never, really, with regard to the user evidence, and I think that might have contributed to the claim coming in when it did. And the other point, obviously, it is a long time ago, but then I understand sometimes that people remember perhaps more clearly what they did 50 years ago than what happened last year. So there does seem to be quite a lot of agreement that people remember walking down Sketchley Lane and then accessing into the field and to the, like you say, to the river to go for a dip when they were kids, and perhaps that is something that you would remember doing quite clearly. And with regard, just the last point, to the bar chart showing all the user evidence ending at the same time, I had to take a view, because the way it was framed in the letters and user evidence forms was we walked it until the early 70s or the mid 70s, and I wasn't able to get in touch with people to work out when they meant, and actually I think that detail probably would have eluded them. So that, all I know is that it was early 70s about. So we've taken 1970 to be on the safe side, but we really couldn't pin that down. So I hope that illuminates some of those points. Thank you.
Okay. Rosita, you.
Thank you, Chairman, and I'd just like to be devil's advocate and to balance the benefits of this in relation to the adverse effect as stated in paragraph 90 on page 21. So could you just update me, because I'd like, as far as I know, if I block up a path for any length of time, whether it is no man's land or not, it eventually can be claimed as my property. So, you know, we could balance this, and the adverse effect of this property we haven't really discussed. So whilst I'm all in favour of extending it, but I think we need to have a little bit more information on the adverse effect. So if you can just talk me through it to get that balance addressed. Thank you.
Are you able to do that?
Yes, thank you. I'll just make a comment. So I guess that the person obviously has the biggest impact is the current postmistress at the village post office, and her sister. They live there together, and that's Miss Amanda Boyd. And she has said to me that she's not going to object to the proposal to make an order. She's not. I wouldn't say that she was happy about it, but that she's taken that stance that, you know, she's going to live with it. So, and obviously the footpath would run past the cottage, so there would be some element of public use. I mean, they're already a post office, so they do have public access in the post office via their own private footpath. I think, you know, maybe we could look at measures that would mitigate it for them slightly, and see whether that, if it comes to it, that will help her, you know, living with the path going forward. Thanks.
Thank you.
If I may come back, Chairman, I think that is a really satisfactory answer to me, to look at some mitigation, because there's also the safety aspect. Because if you have a public footpath going right past your property and that is intensive use, there could be some safety whatever. So I think that would be a very nice thing to do, to note, to look at some mitigation measures, and I would be very happy to support that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. It's been moved and seconded. Already Sean moved it some time ago. So if we can move to the vote, then all in favour, and perhaps we will look at any mitigation that can take place, as Rosita suggested. Okay, anyone against? No. Thank you very much for your detailed presentation. Thank you. Moving on to agenda item number 8 then is the application at Cadeby Quarry. Nick, would you please?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, so this relates to an element of the Cadeby Quarry site. So on page 69 you can see there's a plan which shows the different areas of the quarry site. So areas H and I are the two areas that are on the screen in front of you highlighted in red, and that are subject to the conditions that this application relates to. So two elements to the application. First is to vary condition 2 of the October 2018 permission, and this is the most recent of a number of permissions granted on the site. The new application would allow for the restoration of area H, which is the main part of the site, which I'm indicating on the screen, and also area H is that part, area I is the main part, which would allow that restoration work to be completed by the 31st of December 2019. Now, the restoration has already been extended before and should have been completed by May 18 under an earlier permission, which was then extended to November 18 under a subsequent permission. As set out in the description of the proposal on pages 7 and 8 of the report, the reason for the delay has resulted in the conclusion of the Section 278 highway agreement being linked to the infilling of the conveyor tunnel under Bosworth Road. So Bosworth Road is indicated just there. That's where the conveyor tunnel is. So the delays was a result of confirming that Section 278 agreement. That has now been concluded, and that would allow the closing up of that tunnel. So this is the approved restoration scheme, and you'll see on this plan that there is a hedgerow that cuts across the centre of the site. That's a proposed hedgerow, not an existing one, and follows the pattern of from historic records of where the hedgerow would have gone. So that's what we want, where we wanted it to go, and that's where it was proposed. This application seeks to amend that to relocate the hedge, and there's also a very small alteration to the pond, which you can see just there, just south of the proposed hedge. So this plan shows where the new hedge will be located. So rather than cutting across the centre of the site, which the applicant is concerned would affect the future agricultural use of that field, the hedge is now proposed to be located to the along the north Bosworth Road boundary, adjacent to where the conveyor tunnel would be reinstated. So no difference in terms of the size of the hedge. We'd still get the substantial head, and that will be there. The hedge would be there in perpetuity. We would be concerned if the hedge were going to be located in the place originally located, because the landowner has suggested that may be removed at some point in the future if that interferes with farming practices. Just one or two other images to show you. So this is a photograph showing the approximate location of the approved hedgerow. I'm sorry the images aren't particularly clear, but it just gives you an idea. And then the next image shows the approximate line of where the hedge will now be located. This is a photograph of the southern portal of the conveyor tunnel. So Bosworth Road is where the photographer is stood. So that's looking back towards the site to the south, and that tunnel is the one that would be reinstated. So in terms of the issues to be considered, the extension of time, obviously it's not ideal extending that extension of time, but there are particular circumstances in this case as to why there's been delays. It's all down to the technical and legal reasons for resolving the Section 278 agreement. Those issues are now resolved, and we're content, having discussed this with the applicant, that those works will be completed now by the end of the year. And in terms of relocating the hedge, of course, I think we would have preferred the original location, but in terms of the amount of hedge, the biodiversity value, we're not losing anything by relocating it, and it would allow the flexibility for the applicant to work the land for agricultural purposes once the site has been fully restored. So on that basis, we're content with what's proposed and recommending approval. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Mr Crooks, it's your ward, so if you want to speak first.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm quite happy with what they're applying for. They do seem to have problems with drainage and restoring sites. I've got one in another area of my ward that's causing me concerns, but as long as they get done in the end, I'm happy with that. As I understood it from a site visit that we had some time ago with the tarmac, because I'm on their liaison committee, one of the reasons was they wanted to infill this culvert under the road with stuff that the county weren't happy with, because it weren't going to be, they thought, substantial enough. So that was one of the reasons it was held up. Anyway, my real problem is that in this particular area there are probably a dozen fields that's been excavated at some time or another, and some of them could date back 20 odd years, and I note in the report that stones above a certain size have got to be kept out of it, but the stones are small boulders. They're not stones as such. Nearly all the fields in the area that were restored have got stones in there. It's like a pebble beach. They are the topsoil that was originally on there that made the fields quite good for growing is now shared with a load of stones, and I'm just wondering whether we could reduce, I don't know whether we can reduce that size. I think it was 200 mil or something like that. 100 mil was it, which is 4 inches in size in the old money, down to a smaller size, because there's loads of stones on there that are a couple inches in size. And the other problem is that several of the fields in winter waterlog and they hold water, and I don't know whether it's land drains that they've dug out and not put back, because the old fields, the old farmers used to put the old clay land drains in, you know, and I don't think these are putting them back. There's one that I know particularly where it's again, they've left the hedge out and it's made it a massive field, and it's on a gentle slope, and the part where the footpath is, it was underwater last year for several weeks and it's about a foot deep in places. You couldn't use it, and when they put the new hedge in, they didn't put a ditch in, and I know a lot of fields nowadays don't seem to have ditches, but in the old times they did, you know, and that was the drainage. So there was nowhere for this water to go, and it's apart from the sand further down, it's a bit of clay type soil, so it does hold water. And I just wondered whether we could look at that, perhaps not on this one, but on future ones that they've got to put back, where we reduce the size of the stonage that can be left on it. I don't know whether that's an option or not, but that's my only concern, Chairman.
Okay. Nick.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, it all depends on, I suppose, the quality of the restoration. We always seek on these permissions where land is being restored, reinstated for agricultural use, that the quality of the soil that's being replaced is obviously the material that was taken off originally, so the quality is certainly no worse than what was there originally, and also that any drainage proposals that's been proposed as part of the scheme are adequate to make sure you don't get the pooling of water as part of that. And there are conditions throughout on this quarry, as there are on other quarries, that seek to secure that. Sometimes the difficulty is the detail of making sure that what's actually implemented is exactly has been approved, and it might be that the examples that you've given elsewhere are that we would have approved schemes, but how they've been implemented has resulted in problems since. But we would be happy, of course, to look at any others where you think there are problems, to see whether we believe they've been complied with and see if there are any breaches of any permissions. It may be the historic permissions and there's not much we can do, but there may be conditions where we can enforce. So please sort of bring those to our attention. We'll take a look at that. In relation to this, there's a condition on there, number 40, recommending that the stone size is no more than 100 mil has been suggested already, and I think that's a tried and tested, established principle for allowing agricultural practice. The difficulty is sometimes making sure that there is absolutely nothing there, and making sure that they're sieved, filtered, that there are no stones larger than that, and where there are, they're buried at sufficient depth so that as the land is ploughed, that they don't sort of come to the surface and cause problems. So that is controlled, and provided that's complied with, that would be adequate for agricultural purposes. So I don't think it's necessarily the condition that needs changing, it's more about the enforcement and making sure that it's monitored, that they actually implement that correctly. The other thing to mention is there's also conditions to do with drainage, 27 and 28. So again, provided those schemes are agreed and implemented satisfactorily, that would prevent water from collecting, which would cause obviously problems for agricultural purposes.
Thank you, Nick. Any more questions or comments? Did you move it, Mr. Crooks? Or?
I'm happy with it, Chair.
Yeah. Sean?
Seconded then, Chairman.
Oh, thank you. Moved and seconded then that we commit. All in favour? Thank you. Anyone against? No. Thanks very much. Moving on to item number 9 then. When I can find it. Sharwell Quarry, Gibbet Lane, Sharwell, Leicestershire. Extension of sand and gravel working with Restoration Agriculture. Nick, would you speak to this report, please?
Thank you very much. Item 9 is another application relating to sand and gravel workings, this time at Sharwell Quarry. The application seeks to extend the workings along with restoration proposals, which will, as with the previous item, bring the land back into agricultural purposes. So we have the existing quarry works, which are to the north. I'm sorry if you can see that. We have the tile workings to the east. This application proposes to extend the sand and gravel extraction to the west of the tile works. Warwickshire County Council are currently considering an application to extend the gravel works, sand and gravel works to the east of the A5, so along the strip of the A5. That's being considered at their committee in October next month. So the boundary between the two counties is the line just there. So aerial photograph showing the proposed extraction area. The intention is, as the material is taken out, it would then be transported across to the tile works. So rather than exported via the highway network, it would go straight to the tile works, be used for processing purposes, and then the finished products would be exported. So in that regard, it wouldn't generate additional trips onto the highway network. The area to be extended would provide 850,000 tonnes of material. It will be worked over an 18-month period, and it's intended that the site will be worked from the south to the north, with new soil bunds being created on the north, west and southern boundaries, and that would then be reused back as part of the restoration. As I say, all the material will be used in the processing plant. Once the land has been worked, it would take approximately 1 year to restore the land back to agricultural use. Just a few photographs showing the land. You see in the distance the tile works next to the site. As set out in the report, the review of the Minerals and Waste Local Plan has now reached an advanced stage and will be hopefully adopted by the County Council over the next couple of weeks. That process has identified a shortfall in reserves for sand and gravel in Leicestershire, so it's important that we take the opportunities for further extraction in order to meet the ongoing needs for economic growth across the county and the wider area, provided any adverse impacts are mitigated, and we take those opportunities to safeguard any concerns that arise. Now, this application has been subject to an environmental statement, and the report goes through all the various considerations and how the issues will be mitigated as part of this process. We're content that the impacts are not so significant as to be unable to be controlled, either through the design or through the mitigation or restoration. The scheme would ensure the continued operation of the quarry, and that would extend the employment for those employees who are currently working at the facility for over 2 years. You'll see from paragraph 71 there are redundant buildings on the site, part of the former concrete works, and to ensure that these buildings are cleared, we're recommending a condition that requires those structures to be removed by December 2022. We're also recommending approval subject to a legal agreement and subject to 38 conditions. Happy to take any questions on any of those, but I'll leave it there for now. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Nick. Sure.
Yeah, I mean, as long as we give the archaeologists a good go on the site, given the nearby former Roman settlement, then I think I'll be happy to move this, Chairman.
Michael?
Just a point of clarity on page 95, comments from the Environment Agency. Derogation. That's not come across to me before. What does it mean? Anybody? Legal man will know.
It means covering the situation. Through you, Chairman, I think that's probably the best answer I can give. Making sure things that need to be done are done by the right people.
Rosita?
Just two quick question. One, I've read somewhere a dust mitigating plan or whatever. Could you elaborate on that and on the proposed or the existing footpath? There's, hang on, I'll find it for you. Requires a dust management plan, page 92, number 16, and an update on that. How is that going to be implemented and how does it work? And somewhere the parish council said, what about the footpath? So, but I don't know where that is gone now. Oh, page 95, 34. So, because there's no footpath marked on that.
In answer to the question about dust, this relates to conditions 11 and 12. So condition 11 relates to the requirement of the dust management plan in place. It's standard for a quarry of this type, and that's all about making sure that material that's processed, extracted, and anything that's transported controls dust, so it doesn't spill out and affect residential properties or surrounding sensitive land uses. So that's a standard requirement, and they'll need to agree a scheme with us to make sure that's in place. And condition 12 related to that is the requirement to implement dust control measures that set out the environment statement are put in place. So there's two elements to it to make sure that we protect amenity. In terms of the footpath, I don't have the details of the exact route of the footpath, and it isn't marked on the plan. You're absolutely right. Any impact on any right-of-way would need to go through the proper processes in terms of either temporary or permanent diversions as part of this. I'm not aware that this will be affected, and as a result, that's not something that we're proposing, but it will be subject to a separate process anyway.
If I may come back, but if there is a footpath going through that side, should that not then be considered as part of the application? I mean, you know, the parish council would not have raised it if there wasn't one. So could we just make a mental note to look at that before? Because I've got no hesitation at all to supporting this application. It's just something to note, just to note.
Yeah, happy to do that. There's a paragraph on page 102, paragraph 66, saying there are no public rights of way within the proposed development, but there is a path that runs adjacent to the southern boundary of the site. I think that's probably why it's not marked on. And we were concluding that it doesn't affect the enjoyment of the footpath. So as part of any works, the bunding and any works in relation to that footpath, it's making sure that it doesn't cause any blockages or it doesn't create, you know, an environment that makes it unusable or, you know, nuisance for people who are using that footpath. But I'll note your concerns, and we'll make sure we take that into account.
It's been moved and seconded that we permit this application. All in favour of that? Thank you. Anyone against? No, that's unanimous on you. Item number 11 is the construction of a 80-place ASD Communications Interaction School. Nick, would you please speak to this report?
Chairman, yes, item 11 is an application to construct an 80-place school for children with special education needs, in particular autism. The school will be sited on the vacant Newlands Primary School site. So the site location shows the footprint of the existing school, and at the back there are a couple of hard surface play areas. The playing fields are located to the west of the school building, just on the left hand side. So again, that's shown on this particular plan. So the intention is that the new school will be located and positioned in the same footprint as the existing school. The existing play areas to the north of the school will be retained, as will be the existing playing fields. The access arrangements will be altered, and I'll show you that in a moment. There will be some additional cycle parking and car parking just off Moor Road to the south. The new school would cater for pupils aged 7 to 19. Previously, the school was aged 4 to 11 years. Staffing numbers would be reduced from what was previously on the site. So previously there was 32, and there will be 22 staff proposed as part of this scheme. There is a permission already in place to demolish the school that's already in place, and that was granted in June last year, and the works are currently underway. The school, as you can see, is adjoined by Heath Lane to the north, where there are houses fronting onto that street, and Moor Road to the south is where the access is taken to the school. So this is the proposed layout. So there'll be a car park at the south for 24 vehicles. A new entrance will be formed and a vehicle exit. So there'll be a loop for vehicles to come in and exit the site. You can't see clearly on that plan, but there's an area to the front of the school entrance where taxis and minibuses could stop and drop off pupils to the school. So that wouldn't need to take place on the highway. So this is an image of what the school building would look like, predominantly single story. So a modern construction, mainly render finish with aluminium framed windows and doors. These are the elevations, north and south. So the southern elevation is the one obviously you'd see from Moor Road. And that's the east and the west elevation. And here we have an image showing the internal layout plan to show how the school would be configured. We've received 3 letters of objection, raising concerns about traffic and flooding predominantly. Also received correspondence from Councillor Mrs Richards raising issues about traffic and congestion, and she's asked that these concerns and the response from the County Council's highways officers be provided, summarised for members, and I'll go through that for you. So there's 2 issues that Mrs Richards has raised. First of all, she wants assurances that the congestion and on-street car parking will be monitored, and in response to that, the Highway Authority has commented that the applicant has demonstrated a reduction in trips to the site compared with the previous school. The number of pupils is reduced from 280 to 80. The internal layout of the car park has been redesigned and will obviously accommodate additional car parking compared to previously. And most pupils, as I say, will arrive by taxis or minibus, which will help to reduce waiting on the highway. The Highway Authority has asked for amendments to the existing on-site keep clear markings to tie in with the new access and egress arrangement. So currently there's one point of access and egress, so that would need to be extended along the street. The second issue that Mrs Richards has raised is in relation to the health and safety of pupils if they are arriving by bike, because the proposal is seeking permission for 10 cycle stands. And in response, the Highway Authorities advise that the cycle stands are proposed to reduce vehicle trips, so to encourage sustainable travel, and that's in accordance with policy. They're there for staff and for pupils, those who want to or would be able to travel. The applicant has also provided additional information on that certainly the older children would be more than capable and able to travel to the school by bike, and it's important that we give them the same opportunity to travel by bike as children in any mainstream secondary school. Just finally then, a couple of images of the school. So this is the northwest view facing the existing car park. This is the hard play areas to the north, to the rear of the existing school, which will be retained. And again, just a shot there of the existing school. The new school is in accordance with policy. It's an existing education facility. It's a good quality design, and we're satisfied in terms of the impacts. Certainly less traffic proposed in terms of the road, in terms of the reduced pupil numbers, reduced numbers of trips. And on that basis, we're recommending that permission be granted, Chair.
Thank you, Nick. Mr Crooks, Mr Kaufman.
Chair, just a comment. I'm a casual visitor to this committee. I relate to this application and the one that was dealt with earlier on, the first thing. I thought we've given up with flat roofs because they started leaking and they turned out to be more expensive in the end than pitched roofs. I thought that was a policy of this authority, but I'm obviously wrong. So when you talk about the design of the building and the improvements, do you take account of the problems that I see with flat roofs?
No is the answer to that. It's not a planning issue. It's something that's controlled through building regulations, and also a decision for those who design the building, the architect and the applicant, who of course needs to pay for any maintenance expenses. Flat roofs, in my experience, can be just as good, just as durable, last just as long as pitched roof buildings. It's all about how they're designed, the construction technique, and in design terms, of course, the massing of flat roof buildings is often less than pitched roof buildings, and can have less impact on the surrounding area, both visually and in terms of the impact on neighbours.
You must have all the dodgy flat roofs then.
Mr Crooks, you.
Thank you, Chairman. I share Barwell with Councillor Richards. This end of El Shilton end is Councillor Richards, and I've got the other 2/3 away from this, but we both go to the same parish council meetings and whatever. I welcome this application. It's a much needed resource for disadvantaged children, so and I know that they will be coming from all around the county and probably be shipped in by minibus, so it will be a reduction in traffic. There was problems before, but let's face it, I know it's either being knocked down or it's in the process of it to be knocked down, and it was for 200 odd students, so this is a vast reduction in traffic, and what you've got to remember is this is a big site, what with the playing fields and the playground and the site of the school. If it doesn't go for another school, it could go for 60 or 70 houses, and you could have a lot of traffic then, and it could be all hours of the day and night. So I welcome this application, and I know Barwell Parish Council's in favour, and certainly Hinckley and Bosworth are in favour of it, because we need this sort of facility. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr Crooks. Rosita.
Yes, I welcome this. Being another casual visitor, I've got a casual question. Well, I've got two anyway. I know it's up to the applicant and to the design, but in the light of all our CO2 policies, what does this planning department do to encourage people to have designs which meet those standards? I mean, when we're having a whole total new school, could we not not encourage more solar panels, drain water reusage and whatever. So I would, as a casual visitor, love to know your stand on that. And my second question is, I think this is fantastic, and there's quite a lot on landscaping on page 44 and page 45, and trees to be retained and fencing and whatever. Could you give me a little bit of detail? Now, all of the playing fields are going to the front. There's a main road, but there are an awful lot of houses to the back, and it's just a question for information. You know, there aren't a lot of pupils, but they're quite getting on a bit, so I assume they could be quite noisy. So is that landscaping also proposed between those houses on the top side of the site? And that's all I want to know.
Are you able to give an answer now, Nick?
Thank you for your questions. In terms of the detailed design, sustainable construction is clearly an important part. I remember years ago when we used to deal with the various school applications, and the standards of sustainability in new school construction were set out by government, and we had to reach Building for Life standards, high Building for Life standards, to make sure that the construction, the insulation and the sustainability credentials such as renewables and reuse of grey water, those sorts of things, was high on the priority. The current policy is much more weakened, unfortunately. It's left to a local level, and we now implement local policies. So in this case, of course, Hinckley and Bosworth local plan. So there are policies in there about good design and sustainability, but there are no specific standards that require certain elements of sustainable construction, which is disappointing, but so there's definitely more that can be done. And as we work with colleagues across the county, we try to encourage this, and we're looking at all sorts of things with colleagues from across the county in terms of healthy active planning, sustainable construction, and trying to improve the policy position for those sorts of issues. In terms of this specific application, without looking at the design and access statement, I can't tell you exactly what's proposed, but I'm very confident that there will be good sustainability credentials, and I'm happy to provide that information separately to you if that would help.
If I just may come back, it's somewhat contradictory in a way when you're saying we are actually, all this emphasis is being made by government for us to go carbon neutral, but then, they've withdrawn on the policies. It's a bit of a joke. But could you just, thank you for that, that's really good, but could you elaborate on the landscaping? And I suppose Councillor Brooks got something to say on that.
Yeah, so the landscaping section is on page 144. Paragraph 64 in particular talks about what landscaping is proposed, which talks about hedgerow extension to the east of the entrance. So there's proposed planting by the east of the existing entrance. There is, I'm sorry I don't have a landscaping plan on the image, and that's probably something learning for us, that we can perhaps do that going forward, so we can show you the landscaping details. So there's some small planting and growing zone on the southern side of the school, additional shrub planting. There's also compensatory tree planting to the central part of the site. I mean, the details of this planting quite often doesn't come forward at this stage. It's something that we get is a requirement before the development is commenced. So we agree a scheme, detailed scheme with the applicant to make sure that it either compensates or provides screening or provides visual enhancement to the public areas. Happy to share that with you either, but I'm not sure what we have at the moment, but certainly as that evolves I'm happy to share that with you so you can contribute to what's proposed.
That's quite all right. I'm sure Councillor Brooks got it in hand, but it would have been nice to see as part of the application how the landscaping protection is laid out across the top of the site, where there is a very small difference between the houses, but I thank you for that.
We haven't got a mover at the moment. Mr. Crook.
Just come back on the solar issue. We've asked for a new policy on environment. Funnily enough, I was looking at it last night. I'll put my thing on. And part of it is to include solar, it's to include heat pumps, and we're also looking at grey water retention, which I queried, and apparently that's what they call rainwater. So it's in the pipeline. Like I say, it was published yesterday to members to go through it. I'm happy with it after asking a few questions, and I think, you know, I agree with Councillor Page, we should be going for that all the while.